Jacked up April 30th, 2024. The NFL draft is in the books. The Pittsburgh Steelers have gotten plenty of good grades across the experts from multiple platforms that cover the NFL. I've seen anywhere between B+ to A+ with how the Steelers drafted its 2024 draft class. I'm a fan. I know a lot of other people are fans. We're going to talk a little bit about it and some other topics as well as we talk about the NFL draft and the Pittsburgh Steelers. Joining me on the show today from the Locked On Steelers podcast and the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette, Chris Carter, breaking down the 2024 Steelers draft class. Chris, man, thanks for taking some time.
Of course.
If you had to grade this class, I'll put you on the spot right now. What would you grade the 2024 Steelers draft picks?
Woo. Are we talking like letter grades or like 1 to 10? Okay, we're talking letter grades. I give it a straight A. I think there's certainly some needs that they still need to address, but I might even give it an A+, Jack, because I'm a guy. I study the NFL draft. I study all the prospects. I try to rank them. I try to compare my notes with other people's notes and see okay, where do guys sit? How athletic is each player? How would they fit with the Steelers? And each of the first 4 picks the Steelers got, I ranked them higher than where the Steelers took them. So saying Troy Fautanu, they picked at 20, I had him ranked at 14. Zach Frazier, they picked at 51, I had him ranked at 29. Roman Wilson, they picked him at 80-something, I had him ranked at 45. Even Peyton Wilson, they picked him at 98, I had him ranked at 34. So all 4 of those guys they got in day 1 and day 2 of the draft, they got for great value at positions that can immediately help them. And I think all 4 of them possess great starting potential talent in the NFL. That's why I give this group an A+. And you can even look at the day 3 picks, and there might be some future starters in that group.
Yeah, absolutely. And as we kind of go through each pick, we'll lump the first 2 together because they are offensive linemen. Troy Fautanu from Washington, Zach Frazier from West Virginia, tackle, center. Chris, I can't help but look at these 2 picks and think of these guys as just mainstays on the Steelers offensive line for the next several years. These guys potential have the opportunity to make a couple of Pro Bowls, sign a couple of contracts to stay with the Steelers. It has me fired up because I think between Fautanu, Frazier, and Jones from left to right or right to left, depending on how the Steelers plan on dispersing between Broderick Jones and Troy Fautanu, who's playing on what side of the ball, I think they've got the makings of a very good offensive line and the anchors of a really good offensive line for years to come.
Absolutely. Broderick Jones was my top offensive tackle in last year's class. Fautanu was my 4th best tackle in this year's class, but this was also an insanely talented tackle class. When I look across the board, Jack, and I looked at, guys like Joe Alt it was another level of just his potential. Fashanu of Penn State, who went to the Jets, he was one of the best pure pass blocking tackle of this class. And I thought Fuaga was my best run blocker, but I thought Fautanu was the most athletic of the group. The guy that if you want a guy who's going to get up and move and go get people and bully people, he was going to be in that group just as much as anybody else. I didn't think Fautanu would fall to the Steelers. I thought Fuaga might, because I thought people might look at Fautanu's athleticism and give it a boost. But in my book, that's a heck of a get there. He's a mainstay. I think he's going to play right tackle. I know some people are well, he played left tackle at Washington. Well, guess what? Michael Penix was a left-handed quarterback. So in college, when you have a quarterback like that, that's the front side. You want the traditional left tackle, who's more of the pass blocker, to be on the blind side of the quarterback. So Fautanu, I think, will switch to right side. I don't think it will be that much of a problem. Broderick Jones is more of a left tackle just as far as his build, and it would really work for how this team wants to go. But you throw in Zach Frazier too. I think one thing that you're looking across the board, the Steelers are getting mean, physical road graders. They want to get to the run game. They want to dominate the ground game, and they want to get that going. Even Mason McCormick, the guy they picked out of South Dakota State in the 4th round, he was a guy who wasn't going to start, but he tested very well, a 9.96 relative athletic score, and he projects to be a guy that you sit him for a year or 2, but he could become a starter at guard soon after that. And that could be what they wanted from him, because they have Sayamalu and Daniels right now, though Daniels' contract is up this year, Sayamalu the year after that, and they might need an answer at guard in the next couple of years. So McCormick's potential there is nice, but Frazier, plug-and-play starter. Fautanu, plug-and-play starter on the right tackle, move Broderick Jones to left tackle, and the Steelers may have gone from, at the start of last season, a very iffy offensive line that probably ranked in the mid to low 20s in the NFL, to this year probably could be in the upper half of the NFL.
Yeah, and Omar Khan, since he took over as general manager, had talked about how he wanted this team to get bigger and more physical up front offensively and defensively. But I can't help but look at the way that this draft went. The first two picks, you had mentioned Mason McCormick out of South Dakota State,
Yeah.
3 offensive linemen out of 7 picks. You think Arthur Smith's fingerprints are all over this draft class too?
Absolutely, but I think it's also what the Steelers they've been waiting for a draft like this to make a move like this, because the people are like, oh, they neglected the offensive line for years. No, they just had the most consistent offensive line for the 2010s. Marquise Pouncey, David DeCastro were there forever, and they were supposed to be there longer than they were. Like, people think like, oh, well, they just didn't plan for it. Yeah, they didn't plan for it because Pouncey was supposed to play another 2 to 3 years, as was DeCastro. But when they both left the league, DeCastro was actually on the roster ready to go, and then suffered an injury that made him get a surgery that ended his career in the spring of 2021. Like, people forget that, where he was supposed, like, when they brought in Trey Turner, it was an emergency grab because David DeCastro, who was an all-pro guard, was done for his career. And it was just something he couldn't overcome. That was a very sudden development. And I think that put the Steelers behind an 8 ball that they didn't expect to be behind. And now they're going to be in a position now. Like if you go back to the early 2010s, when the Steelers didn't have a good offensive line, and despite that, won a Super Bowl, in 2008, 2009, when Kevin Colbert drafted Pouncey in 2010, I think it was Gilbert in 2011, and DeCastro in 2012. I think it was that 2013 training camp, one of those training camp years, where Colbert set a line during a press conference, and he said, this group is going to run like a pack of horses very soon. And sure enough, they became one. And you can even look up the Mike Tomlin clip where he was, he came at Stephen A. Smith, who was like, when are you going to get a cornerback? He's like, you used to say that about my offensive lineman. Now what you saying now? And Stephen A. was like, oh, okay, coach, you got me. You did. I did say that. And you did get a great offensive line. I think that's the era that they're in, of developing an offensive line, is they're getting the young guys. But I also think that they have a good mix of experienced older guys in Sayamalo and Daniels, who can hold the fort. And Broderick Jones will now come in with a year's worth of experience. So I think the upside of this group could even be higher. Also because, Jack, you look back at what made that last group: Pouncey at center and DeCastro at guard. Gilbert was a really awesome tackle whose career was just cut short, again, from injury, the unfortunate series of injuries that befell the Steelers in the 2010s. The strength of that team was in the center and the guard position. The strength of this team, if this offensive line develops the way it's supposed to, is going to be at tackle and center. Tackles are the premium position in today's NFL. You have elite tackles. It makes things a lot easier in a lot of directions. You also need a really good center. And I think that Zach Frazier will be that. That's why the Steelers are so excited. And yeah, that's why they invested in it the last 2 years. I honestly think that as long as no one suffers a major injury and guys develop the way they're supposed to, we might not see the Steelers need to pick an offensive lineman for a few years now.
Yeah, absolutely. And you brought up a good point about, the inexperience on this offensive line. 3, maybe even 4 starters could be in their first or second year in the NFL. They have to feel okay with that, given the fact that Russell Wilson's going to be the starting quarterback, right? I mean, that guy's played a lot of football and possesses a lot of great leadership qualities. So that I think the balance of having him and a young offensive line might be able to work, and you might be able to put more of the leadership responsibilities on Wilson's shoulders.
Certainly. I think it's a big factor that shouldn't be overlooked about what Russell Wilson's bringing to the table, even beyond his just raw talents. He's a leader, and he's going to get guys behind him. And I think that's what this team really needed too, at the quarterback position. I think Kenny Pickett could have been that if he had stuck it out. I really think that it's unfortunate that Kenny Pickett isn't with the Steelers, because I think that I thought when they signed Russell Wilson, I was like, this is Kenny Pickett's perfect redemption arc, because Russell Wilson will come in and either A, not play well and Kenny Pickett will be thrown back in, or B, play well and then be gone in a year, and then Kenny Pickett will have worked on things, got bided his time, and then when he came back in, exactly, it'd be a reset. And if he played well after that, I think everyone would forget all the struggles that he had early on, and that would have been great. But now Kenny Pickett's gone, and now the Steelers are in a position where Russell Wilson's doing that anyway, and now you got Justin Fields, who has a higher upside than Kenny Pickett. And again, now you have an offensive line that you've revamped. Now you have, and that's combining with Pat Freiermuth, who's waiting to blow up, Najee Harris and Jaylen Warren, who are the 1-2 punch that they are. You still got George Pickens, Roman Wilson, and like you said, we've been hearing, there's a potential for a wide receiver trade out there right now. The Steelers' offense is in a strong position to take a major uptick from last season, where I believe they finished the year ranking 28th in scoring. And that's even with the last 3 weeks blowing up the way that they did. I think you finally might be able to see this Steelers team rank at least in the middle part of of offensive production in the NFL this year.
Yeah, a lot of rumblings, a lot of names being thrown out about who the Steelers could potentially trade for at the wide receiver position. I'll ask you about that in a minute. But a lot of Wilsons on this team this year with Russell under center, Peyton, Roman drafted in this year's NFL draft. I'll ask you about Roman Wilson, the wide receiver out of Michigan. Seems to bring a lot of good balance between speed and physicality to the position. Where do you see maybe him potentially fitting? And does he have the opportunity to if the Steelers don't trade for a premier name at the receiver position, to be the second option behind George Pickens?
I think he does. I really loved Roman Wilson going into this draft. In fact, like I was telling people like, hey, like he'd be a good second round pick, and he ended up being a third round pick, which is why, again, I give this draft a high grade. I think the one thing that you want to see more of him, though, is beating the press off the line of scrimmage. That's why some people are saying, hey, put him in the slot for now while he grows in that role, because that's a major adjustment in the NFL. Like, it takes time. George Pickens had to adjust to that in his first year. Just NFL sized and athletic dudes that are all consistent with their talent. That's where I think that the Steelers are going to need to see some growth there. But here's the thing: you go in, you see how. You see how things could play out with Roman Wilson. I think he's going to be an explosive, athletic, good route runner, and you're going to see that come to fruition this offense. But I also don't think you're going to see this offense depend on having many three receiver sets. I think you're going to see a lot of double tight end, a lot of use of two running backs, especially with Cordell Patterson in the mix. I think he'll be a veteran option to kind of flex around the offense. And that'll allow for this more balanced attack that this team really wants. And, they're investing in the offensive line. They're not going to ground and pound all day. Like, they're not going to run it 50 times a game, but they're probably going to run it like a little bit less than, I'd say, like more like 40 to 45% of the time, instead of like 30% of the time throwing the ball. And they'll do so because they'll also probably have longer drives in games and have less 3 and outs in games. And that's what they really want, is to possess the football. You go back to last year through like I think up to like week 10, they were like the worst or the second worst time of possession team in football. But if you had just isolated it from like week 10 on to the end of the season, they were actually one of the better teams at possessing the football. And that's where I think the Steelers can really see some improvement there.
Yeah, absolutely. That was one of the things that Mike Tomlin stressed ad nauseum towards the back half of the regular season, and the rumblings of Matt Canada potentially being fired we're going on. We need to possess the ball. We need to win the weighty downs. If I had $1 for every time I heard him at a press conference say weighty downs or possession downs, I wouldn't be working here anymore. Peyton Wilson in round 4. What do you like? I mean, he brings a lot of speed and a lot of big play capabilities at the linebacker position. But from my perspective, I can't help but be just a little bit worried and a little bit concerned about the injury history there.
Certainly, injury history is a big question. I was talking to people that were covered Peyton Wilson at the combine, and I love Peyton Wilson's tape. Like, this guy hits, this guy flies, he goes sideline. He doesn't just go tackle to tackle. He goes sideline to sideline. He's 6'3". He can jump up and tip passes. He can intercept passes. He can sack the quarterback. He can stuff the run. He puts his head in everything. And that's a lot of fun to watch. And last year he was fine, but he does have ACL history. And that's a worry. There are some people who wondered if maybe he would only even be in the NFL for 4 to 5 years because of his injury history. But I think that he was the second of the Steelers' 3rd round picks this year. That's great value for that. Hey, you know what? If your 3rd round pick is a good contributor for about 3 to 4 seasons and then, he aged out of the NFL, that's fine, as long as you're hitting in the other spots as well. And I think that with the way that they've signed Patrick Queen now, you have the potential with your linebacker core that Patrick Queen can be your number 1 and Landon Roberts can start as your number 2. You wait to see if Cole Holcomb ever recovers from his injury. And then you still have Peyton Wilson, who could come in and maybe he becomes your number 3. Maybe he becomes your number 2 with his athleticism. And then there's still also the potential for even beyond that. Maybe they bring back Quan Alexander as something there, but it makes it so that you don't have to depend on a Michael Walker or a Mark Robinson like they did for most of the second half of last year, because they just racked up so many injuries at the position. So I think their linebacker room is just a lot better.
Yeah, and then of the day 3 picks, Mason McCormick, Logan Lee, and Ryan Watts. You kind of talked about this earlier. Would you say that maybe Mason McCormick has the best potential out of the day 3 picks to become a key contributor to this team down the line based off of what he brings to the table and where he's bringing it to what table, right? We talked about the opportunity for him to step in at guard if James Daniels isn't brought back, or Isaac Seumalo in a couple of years.
Absolutely. I look at him and it's the perfect future plan for the Steelers right now. That doesn't cost them too much. Like, oh, you miss on a 4th rounder. Oh, well, like that kind of stuff happens. Like the worst I see is when people are like, oh, that guy's a bust in the 4th round. A bust in the 4th round is a guy that you cut like in the first training camp. Like,
yeah,
outside of the top 3 rounds, you start really flexing the whole bust thing. Like, people called Presley Harvin a bust, and it's like, yeah, sure, he didn't work out, but he was a 7th round pick. Like,
yeah.
Most 7 round picks don't even make it out of your first camp. They're often on your practice squad. So like, for a 4th rounder, I think Mason McCormick, is on a great path to say, hey, there's no pressure on you to start this year because they got starting guard potential there. But now this gives the Steelers flexibility, because let's say James Daniels comes back next year and he signs a great deal for the Steelers and he could be there long term. Well, then you have Seumalo and him for another year, but Seumalo's contract is gonna be up after that, and Seumalo is also older. He'll be in his mid-30s by then, and that'll be the time when you probably say like, all right, we can let him go. Mason, you ready? If not, they go and get a guard. If he is, great. You put him in there. And I'm sure with the Steelers injury luck that they have, they're probably going to need him at some point. And then you'll get a chance to see what he brings to the table. So I think he's a great mix. He's a good size for a guard, and his athleticism chart. Go check out his relative athletic score. He tests very well. I liken this pick a lot to the placement of Kevin Dotson. I know some people probably think like, whoa, that Kevin Dotson didn't work out. He worked out for the Rams, but not the Steelers. But the difference was Kevin Dotson came into the league injured, and he dealt with a lot of injuries throughout his time with the Steelers, and it really kept him from ever getting settled in Pittsburgh, like to the point where if you go look up his relative athletic score, there isn't one, because he couldn't test at all, either at his pro day or at the combine. And that's not a problem for McCormick, and McCormick tested very highly. I think McCormick has more upside, and I think that because the other problem was Kevin Dotson ended up getting thrown in a little bit earlier than the Steelers wanted because their guards, dissipated from injury. As long as that doesn't happen to this crew, I think McCormick will have plenty of time to develop, and he has a good chance of developing into that player they need.
Yeah, back to talking about that bust in the. I think the only one that could qualify is when they drafted Colin Holba, the long snapper. And then you end up cutting him for a guy you signed as an undrafted free agent. Other than that, busts in rounds 6 and 7 don't exist. Yeah. He's Chris Carter of the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette Locked On Steelers podcast. Before I send you packing here, Chris, we have to talk about the news that's heating up. There have been, chirpings from different, local media, national media saying, whoa, here comes Omar. He's cooking. Here comes a wide receiver to Pittsburgh. I think Bryant McFadden really started that conversation on Monday. Who do you think the most likely name that's out there that might be available, maybe that has been talked about or hasn't been talked about, that could be coming to Pittsburgh via trade here in the next couple days, couple weeks? Who the heck knows?
I really look at a guy. I often look for ties, like guys that have ties to certain people on the roster, on this coaching staff. And there's one person in particular who has multiple ties has ties in both. And that's Clayton Sutton out of the Broncos. He worked with the Steelers wide receiver coach, and of course he caught passes from Russell Wilson, and reportedly was very cool with Russell Wilson in Denver. So, and the Broncos have added multiple receivers this offseason. Maybe they want to move on from some things and kind of reset some things on their own roster right now. Maybe they don't. Maybe they want to keep him with Bo Nix. Who knows? But if the Steelers can get him for anything less than a 3rd round pick, if it could be a 4th and some change, that's the perfect value for this. Because you look at what Stephon Diggs, what the Bills got for Stephon Diggs, it wasn't a whole lot. So like, that's what I'm saying. Like, hey, that's the move is get a guy who you don't have to pay a whole lot for, and he could be a veteran who comes in, makes a difference for a few years. And if you want to keep him, keep him. But the thing is that the Steelers don't want to be in a position where they have to pay a guy long-term to be their top wide receiver when they might be expecting to pay George Pickens. And I think George Pickens still has to prove that these next 2 years before they actually do that. But I think that he's talent-wise, he's who you want. It's just a matter, will he continue to grow, or will he get in his own way, kind of like Chase Claypool did? So Clayton Sutton's the name I got, but I wouldn't be shocked at a DK Metcalf. I wouldn't be shocked at a, Actually, I actually, there are names I would be shocked at. Like I reported this Monday evening. I talked to a source of mine that's like around the Raiders a lot, and they told me, they were like, look, because I saw people say Devontae Adams, what about him? And I was like, I know this person knows if that's even the case. And they were like, yeah, that's a joke. He ain't going nowhere. So don't think Devontae Adams. I wouldn't put Justin Jefferson or anything like in there. That's crazy. But Cortland Sutton, Deebo Samuel, Brandon Ayuk, one of those guys make a lot more sense than one of those big name guys. But I think that's all this team really needs, because again, this team's going to be a more balanced offense. And I think with balanced offense, you don't need to have superstar wide receivers. You need to have good wide receivers, decent quarterback play, a strong offensive line with a good run game. And I think that if they add one of those names I just said, they'll have all of that.
Yeah, and it seems like too, if I'm the Steelers, I want to be maybe delicate with this situation, because you've got a guy like George Pickens who has shown flashes of being a little bit of a diva in that wide receivers room. And if you go out and get a guy maybe like Deebo Samuel or Brandon Ayuk, that might threaten him a little bit, threaten the ego a little bit. But if you go out and get a guy like Cortland Sutton, he might feel a little bit more at ease with being the top receiver in this offense. I think George Pickens will be, no matter if they go out and get somebody like that or not. But if you go out and get a guy like Brandon Ayuk, you might have to wonder how him and George Pickens would gel in that receivers room. Would you agree?
Here's my thing. I agree that might be a concern. I think that could be something to hear. But here's where I'm on that. I think the Steelers are over having to walk around eggshells just for their players' egos. I think they saw that you saw it with Kenny Pickett. I think they're in a position where, look, you don't like it that we went and got someone else that could be good, that you feel could challenge you. Get over it. We're trying to win football games. That's the Steelers' approach right now. So if George Pickens throws an attitude and wants to leave it, you know what? We don't need you. We'll go get another guy, and then we'll draft a guy next year who will do just as good as you did, because that's what the Steelers' belief is. They think they have a really good guy in Roman Wilson. So I think that the Steelers need to add who they think they should add, and then after that, see what it would take. See if they can, if George Pickens wants to stick along with that, and if George Pickens grows into it. Because here's the other thing: if you're the Steelers, you're not just picking around, you're trying to give yourself multiple chances to hit and find the guy that you want to sign right now long term. And Cortland Sutton, he's on, I think his contract situation just works perfectly for what the Steelers need right now. For example, with the Broncos, he's signed for the next 2 seasons. If they traded for him, the Broncos, and the Broncos ate the normal dead money that they would in a trade for that, the Steelers would only owe him $7.7 million. And guess how much money they cleared up with the Alex Highsmith restructure? $7 million. That adds up. So I guess another reason why I think it's Cortland Sutton. But then even the year after that, in 2025, if the Steelers kept him, the Steelers would probably owe him like $14-ish million or so. And that's not bad for 1 year, where George Pickens still won't be owed a new contract, because that'll be the last year of his rookie deal. And then that could put you in a position to be like, hey, has George Pickens earned it, or do we need to go a different direction? And then I think that lines up very well with what the Steelers are trying to do. Whereas, if you get a Brandon Ayuk's going to want a new contract. And if you saw what Amon-Ra St. Brown made, that's going to be a lot of money. I'm not so sure the Steelers can do that. Deebo Samuel's contract a bit different. His runs out in 2025, but he's also a big salary cap hit. I just think Cortland Sutton makes the most sense contractually and timeline-wise for the Steelers right now.
Yeah, he caught 10 touchdowns last year, too, so over 700 yards. Deontay Johnson gave you 5 in the last 2 years, so that could potentially...
And who he catch most of them touchdowns from?
Number 3, Mr. Unlimited.
Exactly.
Chris Carter from the Locked On Steelers podcast. Check him out also on the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette. Chris, thanks for taking a couple of minutes this afternoon. Appreciate it, man.
Thanks for having me, Jack.